Tonight, though, we are starting with what we consider to be a very important topic. You might know this is called Let's Talk About Homosexuality. Not necessarily the most creative title, but I think an accurate title, because some of the other ideas that were going through my mind were, let's freak out about homosexuality, or maybe let's fight about homosexuality. And there would be good precedent for that, wouldn't there? I don't know if you keep up to date on the news in our country or even the Christian news in our country, but if you've ever read the internet, you know that this is a hugely contentious topic in culture at large, but I think especially among the Christian community. I mean, note recent events related to World Vision, among other things. What we see all around us, unless you have very gracious people who live around you, I hope you do, but what I see when I look out is people and even Christians who, for all intents and purposes, look like they hate each other, right? People who are Christians who say they've devoted themselves to following the example of Jesus. Following the example of the Jesus whom we believe is actually one day going to have everything on this earth summed up into himself. And yet we talk about each other and we shout at each other as if we're enemies. Tonight's event is not necessarily about changing anyone's mind about issues, okay? As I look out at this very nice looking crowd tonight, I know that there are people here who believe any number of opinions about Christianity and homosexuality in particular. Probably 450 separate perspectives here tonight. And tonight, our speakers are going to talk to us about some of the different Christian ways of viewing this subject. But I'm personally not hoping that anybody's mind is necessarily changed tonight, because that's not why we're here. We're here to be educated about the topic, but even more so, we're here to learn how to dialogue as sisters and brothers and not enemies. Does that sound okay? Are you guys up for that? That means actually checking our own hearts, because we have this tendency when people say something that we feel very strongly against, we have this tendency to think they're evil, right? And that's the opportunity for us to say, am I a follower of Christ in this moment or not? So I would like to invite us to open our ears, open our hearts, listen especially close to people we disagree with, and maybe we'll all be changed into a kind of community that's not embarrassing to the rest of the Christian world, like I've felt embarrassed in some of these past months. I think we can do better than that, because we are falcons, right? Before I introduce our speakers, in order to really underscore the fact that this is a family conversation, we are brothers and sisters here tonight, I'd like to invite two of our worship leaders from group, Nolan and Camille, to come up and lead us in a good old Charles Wesley hymn with a little David Crowder twist. But I would invite you to stand now as we sing, "Oh, for 1,000 Tongues to Sing." And now it is my honor to introduce our speakers tonight, who have come to us from other places in our country, like Missouri and North Carolina. And these guys are well known among churches and colleges and media outlets and booksellers. These are people who are speaking about this dialogue between different perspectives on Christianity and homosexuality in a way that's very compelling, in a way that is full of love and friendship. You can see when they speak, these are friends, and yet they do not agree about this subject. They'll explain a little bit more about their positions, but they're here to teach us about the ways that you can see this subject, but more importantly, how to talk to each other in the midst of it. So would you please join me in welcoming Ron Belgau and Justin Lee.
Hey, what's up? My name is Justin. This is Ron. We have been good friends for many years. Since we were little boys, long, long ago. We are both committed Christians, and we both have a little personal experience with this topic. Ron and I agree on a lot of things, but we strongly disagree on how the church should counsel someone who is attracted to the same sex, specifically when it comes to sexual morality. So I believe that gender is not the deciding factor in whether a relationship is moral or immoral. There are a lot of factors, but gender is not the deciding one. And Ron believes that sex ought to be between a man and a woman, that this is how God designed it, and that sex outside of a marriage relationship between a man and a woman is sinful. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how we came to those conclusions. We also would like to talk first about how we agree, because in spite of the fact that we disagree on a really important question, we agree actually on a lot of things regarding how the church should treat folks who are gay or bi, as well as folks who are transgender, although that's not something that we're going to be talking a lot about specifically this evening. Now, Ron and I both speak a lot separately, and we're used to speaking by ourselves, but when we do speak together, we try to make sure that we have equal time, and so we have a little chess clock here. We also want to make sure that we don't run over, so we've got time for Q&A. So if you hear me start talking really, really fast at some point, it's probably because I'm running out of time. So let me start by telling you a little bit about my story, and then Ron's going to share his, and then we'll talk some about how we agree, and then we'll talk about how we disagree. Those of you who came just to hear the disagree part, I'm sorry, you're here for the whole thing. So I grew up as really the super Christian kid. You know, I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. I still, to this day, identify as an evangelical Christian. I'm proud to be an evangelical. But as a kid, I was the kind of obnoxious kid who was ready to preach at everyone. You know, I had my Bible in my backpack and a bunch of tracts about salvation, and I was always looking for a chance to debate with folks and tell them how they were wrong about some issue and what the Bible had to say and how the Bible proved them wrong, and that my view was the Christian view. My nickname in high school was God Boy. Yeah, I can tell that some of you knew that kid in high school. To those of you who knew God Boy in high school, I deeply apologize. Some of you were that kid in high school. So, hey. I lived the super Christian life. You know, I wore Christian t-shirts. I listened to only Christian music. I played Christian video games. No, this is a thing. This is a thing, yeah. When I was a kid, one of the really popular video games was a game called The Legend of Zelda. Maybe some of you have heard of it, yeah. Yeah, the original one on the NES, back when I was a little boy. And so Legend of Zelda was really popular, so this company called Wisdom Tree came out with their own, well, let's call it what it is, ripoff of The Legend of Zelda called Spiritual Warfare. This is real. This is real life, people. So in The Legend of Zelda, you're trying to save a princess. In spiritual warfare, you're battling the powers of darkness. In The Legend of Zelda, you collect weapons along your quest. In spiritual warfare, you collect the fruits of the Spirit. Only they're actual fruits, apples and pomegranates and bananas. And I'm not kidding, this is real. And in The Legend of Zelda, your enemies are monsters. In spiritual warfare, your enemies are the unsaved. Right? So when you encounter the unsaved, you throw the fruit of the Spirit at them. or blow them up with vials of God's wrath, right? I don't know whether to gasp or laugh. At which point they repent, convert, and disappear. So this is kind of everything that's wrong with certain... As I drop my water, this is kind of everything that's wrong with certain brands of evangelical Christianity, all wrapped up in one tiny package. But it's kind of the way that I saw the world, you know? Like, it's my job to go out there and throw the truth at people and convert them. It's not really a very Christian way to approach life. But I love to debate, and I thought that I was being loving by sharing the truth. And on the subject of homosexuality, I knew that I knew everything there was to know on the subject. I was God boy. I knew that being gay was a choice, I knew that it was a sin, and I knew that it was my responsibility to speak out against it. That probably would have been the end of my story were it not for the fact that God boy had a secret. I thought it was the worst secret in the world, the worst secret anyone could ever possibly have, the secret I would take with me to my grave. And that was that when I hit puberty and all my guy friends were starting to notice girls for the first time, you really notice them. It's weird how it happens. Like one day they have cooties and then all of a sudden the next day they have boobs. And I always check for lightning if I say that in a Christian environment. I was going through the opposite experience. I was starting to notice guys. And I didn't really understand it. And at first I thought, well, this is just a weird, it's a phase. It's a weird quirk of puberty or something. You get weird feelings in puberty, like who knows why. And so I tried not to think about it. I tried to stay focused on, my faith, my walk with Christ, and my schoolwork and my family. And as I got older, it wasn't going away. The feelings just kept getting stronger and stronger. And I considered myself straight. I dated girls, and yet these feelings for guys, I couldn't escape. They were there all the time. I could try not to think about them during the day, and then I would go home at night and go to sleep, and I would dream about guys and wake up feeling like there was something really wrong with me. It got to the point that I was crying myself to sleep night after night, begging God, please don't let me feel this way anymore. And I didn't know what to do. It never occurred to me that I could be gay because Christians aren't gay. That's a choice and a sin and something I would never do. My image of gay people was that they spent their time marching in thongs in pride parades or something and having weird, abnormal sex. And that wasn't me. I was waiting until I got married to have sex. But eventually I couldn't deny the fact that I was dating this beautiful girl and all my guy friends were drooling over her, and I felt nothing. She was like my sister. I didn't feel anything for any girl. Never had. And finally, when I was 18, it clicked for the first time, and I realized, oh, this is what people mean when they say gay. They mean someone who's attracted to the same sex. See, I always thought that the word gay meant someone who was doing something, and all of a sudden I was like, oh no, it's this. It's this thing that I'm feeling right now. That's what people mean when they say someone is gay. And it was weird because it was like, on the one hand, I felt, it was like the most horrifying thing I could ever think about myself, and on the other hand, it was like this tremendous sense of relief. It was like going to doctor after doctor with weird symptoms, trying to get some kind of sense of what's going on, and finally finding one doctor who says, I know what you have. I know what's wrong with you. There's a name for this. I can give you a diagnosis. And even if it's a terrible diagnosis, there's some measure of relief in finally having a word for what you're experiencing and knowing that you're not crazy. You're not the only one in the world. So I realized I was gay, but then I was like, well, okay, if I have a diagnosis, now I need a cure. So I got connected with what are popularly known as ex-gay ministries, where I thought that they would help me become straight, but I quickly learned that they could help people stop having promiscuous gay sex, but those people never actually became straight. I talked to people who were the success stories of the movement, and they said, no, look, your attractions don't actually change. You could stop your behavior, but I'm like, well, I don't have any behavior to stop. I'm God boy. What are you talking about? I found that the church didn't really know how to take this, because everyone I knew assumed that gay people chose to be gay and could choose not to be. And the response of the church was kind of like, there's an episode of South Park where Stan finds out his dog Sparky is gay, and he tries to train him, and he sits him down, he's like, sit Sparky, good boy, now shake, good boy, now don't be gay, don't be gay Spark, don't be gay. And of course Cartman's like, he still is pretty gay to me, but I learned that the church, at least the church as I knew it, didn't really know what to do with me other than say, well, just don't be gay. And I said, well, I don't know how to not be gay. And what if I'm like this for the rest of my life? Then what? Do I commit myself to lifelong celibacy? If so, that's scary. If it's what God wants me to do, I'll do it, but that's pretty terrifying. Have I misinterpreted the Bible? Could I have a committed relationship? And I started wrestling with all of this, and I found that I was wrestling with it alone. That even if I committed myself to lifelong celibacy, there were a lot of Christians who had already written me off as not really a Christian, or I wouldn't be dealing with this. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. So in a few minutes, I will tell you more about my biblical journey and where I came out on it, although, spoiler alert, it's already been on the screen. But this is kind of where I come from. This is how I enter this conversation. I've written a book on the subject called Torn, Rescuing the Gospel from the Gays versus Christians Debate, which is available if you would like to purchase copies after this. There's a lot more that Ron and I both could share with you than what we have time to share this evening. But this is about people's lives. This is not just an intellectual debate for either of us. And so it's important for us to look at how we can agree as well as how we disagree, and how we move forward as brothers and sisters in Christ on a really, really challenging topic.
All right, so first of all, you should know that Justin is the funny one. So don't expect quite as many laughs from me as you get from him. Second, he's way more Christian than I am. I would never have been quite as bad as God Boy when I was in high school. Like Justin, I grew up as a Southern Baptist, although I grew up as a Southern Baptist actually here in Washington State, where we're not as crazy here, even if we're Southern Baptist, as you can be in North Carolina. And another thing about growing up Southern Baptist in Washington State, so this was in the 1980s, when you're starting to see the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, but that was having a lot more impact in the South than it had up here. And so there was this somewhat schizophrenic experience that I had growing up of a Southern Baptist church that was still in many ways the kind of classically Southern Baptist, not involved in politics, focused on showing grace to people, on providing welcome to people. The church that I went to, you could see a deacon who was a retired bank manager, bank vice president, greeting a recovering drug addict who's dressed, the bank vice president has his three-piece suit and cufflinks and everything, and recovering drug addict in torn t-shirt, jeans. So there was, on the one hand, this very apolitical, very focused on showing grace to people, kind of Southern Baptist experience. But then every so often we would get revival preachers who would come up from Texas or places like that. And there you got a slightly different flavor of Southern Baptist. So there we would have things like someone saying, a revival preacher saying that unless America brings back the death penalty for homosexuality, God will destroy America the way he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's a slight difference in the sort of welcoming, showing grace, embracing people approach and the killing people approach. So that was kind of the contrast that I was experiencing growing up. I want to, before describing realizing that I was gay, I want to say a little bit about sort of how I came to that realization. I think one of the things that we often don't think about as much, our culture gets very caught up in talking about sex, sexuality. It's obviously a big part of entertainment and so forth. But I think a lot of times we forget that long before there's hormones and all of the stuff that we really get focused on, as you're growing up as a kid, you see the adults around you married, and it's sort of you have this expectation that sooner or later I'm going to get married, and long before there's any experience of lustful desire or physical desire, there's just the desire for this sense of belonging, desire to have children, and so that's something, as I was growing up, I had female friends and thought about, which of these female friends might make sense to get married at some point, who was smart enough and so forth. Well, I mean, what other reason would you be attracted? And on the other hand, I had male friends and did a lot of stuff with them. Was close to them. I remember thinking about, imagining these futures of spending my life working with, like maybe start a company together with one of my close male friends, or go to Mars together. But so these things where, looking back, I can see a certain sense in which I was thinking more about connection with male friends than with female friends. But on the other hand, a lot of boys, middle school, that age, are much closer to their male friends than they are to female friends. So it's hard to know exactly how much of that was indication, like early indication of attraction to other guys. Certainly wasn't something that I was thinking about in explicitly sexual terms at that point. So unlike Justin, who dithered about for a very long time before realizing that he was gay, I realized it very quickly after hormones started to hit. And as soon as I realized it, my reaction was to think that the Southern Baptist revival pastors were obviously stupid. Because, so for me, there was a friend that I'd been particularly close to for a number of years by the time that I realized that I was gay. And then started realizing that I was physically attracted to him. But, when I listened to the Southern Baptist revival pastors talking about this as if it was going to destroy the planet, it seemed to me they were a little crazy. This was obviously different from what my peers were experiencing in that I was attracted to men, but it was not it wasn't the way that it was described, as Justin suggested, the sort of really wild, crazy thing. It was, if anything, in some ways, as I looked at, I was a bit of a late bloomer, and I'd watched my friends become more and more interested in girls and thought, you guys are a little crazy. And so in some ways, what I was thinking was more innocent than what I heard, things that I'd heard straight friends discussing in the locker room and so forth. And so it just really, my reaction was, The conservative Christian approach is just crazy. They don't know what they're talking about. However, as time went by, I started to think more, I think this is crazy, but how am I going to articulate that? One thing that Justin and I share is a love of debate and a love of argument. It's probably what has brought us this far together. We've only been doing it for 15 years now. And he hasn't listened yet. I'll win, but it's just taking a while. But I started to think about how to, not just take this sort of innate sense that I was right, and that there was obviously these very different grading curves being used for gay people and straight people in the church, but really trying to articulate how would I make the kind of biblical case that Justin is going to attempt to make in a little bit. How would I make that case for myself and for other people? And so one of the things, I'll talk about this more, but as I started to look at the Bible, I started to realize maybe the problem with the two grading curves is, at least in part, that the curve for straight people has become too lax. Not that we should be killing gay people, obviously, but that there's also a lot of ways that the church was being more lax with straight people. One thing also that I realized was, part of my argument was the church has changed a lot of its views in the last, it was 30 or 40 years then, it's longer now. The church has changed a lot of its views, and so we should change our view on homosexuality too. But then I started to ask myself, is this really a good thing that we've changed our views? I thought about the drama that was caused by some of my friends who were having sex before marriage. I thought about some of the pain that was caused to friends whose parents had divorced and remarried, and the blended families and all of the things that go with that. Another thing, and it's difficult to talk about experiences where you feel like God is speaking to you, because I don't want to make it sound too much like God speaking out of the fire on the mountain or anything like that. But one of the things that, as I was trying to formulate this argument, I paid a lot of attention to the story of David and Jonathan. And the story of their love was a very powerful one that I was very drawn to. But as I was sort of reflecting on that and thinking, trying to convince God that this was, he'd put it in the Bible and therefore it proved that gay sex was okay, whatever he said. If you're a Baptist, you think that you can second guess God with the Bible if you've got a good argument. But one of the things that I realized, and I think it's safe to say that this was something God sort of pushed at me as I was thinking about this, is that sex is not the same as love. And I think this is something that our culture especially really needs to think about, is the way that I think American culture has become very focused on sex, and the Bible is, love is really important to Christians, but it's not the same thing. And I'll flesh that out a little bit more later, but now I'll turn it back to Justin. Oh, you're right. I have to find this. All right. So Justin and I like to talk about building bridges between people who disagree. So we were actually really excited that we get to come to Washington State, which there's some really great bridge building here. Maybe this is why the state has started digging tunnels. I don't know. So what we're going to do now that you've heard a little bit of our personal stories, is talk about 8 practical tips for building bridges that hopefully will last a little bit better than the bridges that we just looked at. So the first tip is don't make homosexuality a litmus test. Obviously, we could talk about this for a long time, but I'm just going to use one example. In the 1980s, the Episcopal Church elected John Shelby Spong as a bishop. And as time went by, John Shelby Spong became, let us say, more and more controversial, doing things like denying the existence of God, the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, various things like that. And a lot of Episcopalians were uncomfortable with that. They had to drink an extra shot of scotch. However, Episcopalians are very good at dealing with disagreement, and so they kept, agreeing to disagree with John Shelby Spong. And then in 2003, Gene Robinson was elected bishop. Gene Robinson wouldn't be my first choice for a bishop, but as far as I can tell, he's a sort of, by Episcopal standards, moderate evangelical. And certainly not on major core Christian teachings, by any means the most radical Episcopal bishop, but he's gay. And so the Episcopal Church split. Now, just for me, I would be more willing to be in communion with someone who believed in God but disagreed with me on homosexuality than I would be with a bishop who was a leader of an entire diocese who denied the existence of God. And so this is what we mean by making homosexuality a litmus test. A lot of American Christians get way too worked up. And if this is what the Episcopalians do, let's talk about the Southern Baptists.
All right, number 2. You have to define your terms. Now, this may sound really obvious, but you would be amazed how many of the arguments that happen in these kinds of conversations. Get your prepositions right, Justin. You'd be amazed how many arguments happen in these kind of conversations because people failed to define their terms. Terms like, they're the obvious ones, like LGBT. People throw a term like that out and sometimes forget to clarify for the folks in the room who may not know that LGBT is a BLT with guacamole. And they're delicious. No, it means lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. It's a term that a lot of folks in that community prefer because, for instance, not everyone in the LGBT umbrella is gay. Speaking of gay, by the way, that's another term that we throw around a lot, and if you notice in my story, I talk about how I used to define gay one way, and now I define it a different way. So I define gay as someone who is attracted to the same sex. Well, this is important because as I've talked to LGBT folks, I find that almost universally, LGBT folks define words like gay and bi and straight based on who you're attracted to, not who you're having sex with, not who you're in a relationship with. So even if I were never to have a romantic or sexual relationship in my life, I would still be defined as gay. Whereas a lot of conservative Christians use the words gay and bi to refer to people's sexual behavior, which causes then a lot of conflict when we talk about something like, do people choose to be gay? Well, if you don't define the word gay the same way, then we're just going to be talking past each other. Or like homosexuality, people throw that term around. Homosexuality, do you think homosexuality is a sin? People ask me. And I say, well, do you think people ought to wait until they get married to have sex? And if they say yes, I say, well, do you think heterosexuality before marriage is a sin? Because, takes a second to sink in, right? It's like a 12-year-old girl who notices like there's an attractive guy in her class. That's heterosexuality, you know? Like a guy and a girl who go to the movies and hold hands. That's heterosexuality before marriage. Heterosexuality and homosexuality can refer to, you know, sex, but they could also refer to what you feel inside. They could refer to dating. They could refer to romance. They could refer to a relationship. They could refer to a marriage. They could refer to who you are, if you are straight or you are gay. And so when someone says, I think homosexuality is a sin, what they probably mean is, I think gay sex is a sin. But what I hear as a gay person is, I think your existence is a sin. And that's a problem. One more word I'll throw out is the word homosexual, which a lot of gay people actually don't like the word homosexual and prefer to be called gay. There are some anti-gay groups who know this and use the term homosexual intentionally, which makes gay people hate the term even more. There was an example a few years ago of an organization that was taking Associated Press news stories and had a computer program that would then republish them on their website with the word gay changed to homosexual every single time, which, you know, was kind of funny when a sprinter named Tyson Gay homosexual eases into 100 final at Olympic trials. Tyson homosexual easily won his semifinal for the 100 meter. On Saturday, homosexual misjudged the finish in his opening heat. So be careful about your terms and make sure to define them.
All right. Another thing that's important to do is to distinguish orientation and behavior. So first of all, even on the traditional understanding that I will try to put forward, where we think that any homosexual act would be a sin, the desire for that at most is a temptation. And in Christian theology, we make a pretty important distinction between temptation and sin, because if we didn't, the temptation of Jesus would be a problem. Jesus was tempted in every way, yet without sin. So it's important to distinguish orientation and behavior for that reason. But also, I think it's important to recognize that sexuality is a lot more than just temptation to lust. It affects the way that we interact with people in a lot of ways that go far beyond just desiring to have sex with people or being tempted to have sex with people. And if we don't make this distinction, if we only focus on our position on sexual ethics for same-sex relationships, it's very easy to get into a position where you sort of respond to any kind of same-sex relationship as dangerous or a problem and want to force people into a kind of corner away from everyone. It's worth noting that whatever temptations there may be in relationships with other people, there are also a lot of temptations in sitting alone in your apartment every night. That a lot of times, the way to build chastity is to develop healthy relationships with people, including people who are of the sex that you could be attracted to. If you don't learn to do that, you often end up being much more vulnerable to lust. And so it's really important to distinguish that and not allow the teaching on specific sexual acts to spread out and interfere with all of our thoughts about relationships, desire, etc.
Fourth, seek first to understand and then to be understood. It's one of Stephen Covey's 7 habits of highly effective people. Yeah, 7 habits of highly effective people. Now, this is important because this is not saying, you know, hey man, can we all get along? I mean, everyone's opinion is equally valid, man. Like, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is it's important for us to understand where the other person's coming from, even if we think they're completely wrong. We don't ever think, when we have a conversation like this, that the people sitting across the table from us are just as right as we are, if they're saying something that we disagree with, right? mean, nobody here thinks everyone else's opinion is. I mean, if I say, well, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream or something, then okay, everyone's opinion is equally valid, unless you choose butter pecan, in which case you're wrong and you're going to hell. But the point is that we want to change each other's minds. Ron and I want to change each other's minds. We disagree strongly, and we both agree that this is an important issue. But we also know that just arguing with each other isn't likely to change each other's minds. Listening to one another, emphasizing the friendship that we have, and trying to understand where each other is coming from is much more effective than any debate or argument will ever be.
It's also important to emphasize people don't choose to be gay. So what do I mean by that? Well, sexual attraction is something that people experience. I mean, there's certainly ways that we can learn to direct our attractions. We can learn to, if we're tempted to look away, those sorts of things. But the fact that some people are attracted to men and some people are attracted to women is something that people discover more than something that one day they choose this or that. I mean, if you could choose whether or not to have sexual attractions, probably almost everyone who believed in Christian teaching would wait till they were 22, 23 to have sexual attractions. Maybe, now that you need to get a grad degree, wait till you're 25 or 30. But this is something where this experience is something that we just discover. And, it's worth stressing there's complexity here. Some people are bisexual. They're somewhat attracted to one sex, somewhat attracted to the other. Others experience some sexual fluidity, that at one time of their life they'll be attracted one way, at another time they'll be attracted another. There are various different ways that people can be attracted. That sometimes a relationship will start more with emotional attraction, and then later physical attraction will follow. Sometimes a relationship will start more with physical attraction, and then emotional attraction will follow. So there's a lot of complexity here, but it's not something that people can just choose, I'm going to be attracted to the opposite sex. Thank you.
All right. Sneak preview. Share stories. This is one of the most important ways that you can build bridges in this kind of conversation. We often end up spending all of our time arguing about the Bible. And as Christians, Ron and I both believe that the Bible is of central importance in this conversation. But we also know that our personal stories help us understand one another and help us have a gracious, compassionate dialogue in a way that arguments about the Bible don't. Stories also are much more likely to actually change people's minds if you are trying to change somebody's mind. So, as an example, how many of you have seen the film E.T.? Okay, the rest of you are deprived. I'm sorry. You probably eat butter pecan. So, after you see E.T., E.T. is this just adorable, cuddly kind of alien, right? After you see E.T., if you hear that extraterrestrial aliens are coming to Earth, you're excited. It's like, oh my gosh, aliens are coming to Earth. This is amazing. I can't wait to meet E.T., right? But maybe your next door neighbor is like, oh no, blow them out of the sky. I don't want those things getting close to my doorstep. Because your next door neighbor's never seen E.T., but he has seen War of the Worlds. She has a very different image, right, of what's about to happen. Well, one of the things that I notice in these kinds of conversations is that there are a lot of LGBT people who view Christians, or conservative Christians in particular, like this. This is their image. And there are a lot of conservative Christians who view this as what's going to happen if gay people continue to get their way in America, right? The reality is, if we can focus on, right? Listen, if that apocalypse scenario is what your next door neighbor is envisioning, no Bible argument you can make is going to change his mind about these aliens. But if he has a chance to hear E.T.'s story, to get to know E.T., and to make this a human issue, it will change his attitude. And that is true whether you're talking to someone who doesn't like gay people or someone who doesn't like Christians or anyone on any side of this issue. Tell your story. Talk about why you care. Talk about what you've been through and let them share theirs. I promise you it will change more hearts and minds than all the arguments you can come up with.
All right. Another thing that's important to emphasize, remember that one of the less popular parts of Jesus' teaching in the New Testament was love our enemies. So for Christians, when Jesus is talking about enemies, those are, for example, the people who nailed him to a cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is Palm Sunday. We're moving into Holy Week and Easter. This is what we're thinking about. So this, one sort of disagreement that Jesus encountered in his life was, you should be killed. And his reaction to that was to ask forgiveness for those who were in the process of killing him. And so, Justin and I get along better than that. Neither of us has attempted to kill the other yet. But I want to emphasize, I'm stressing, here's, for Christians, even when the stakes are that high, love your enemies. So when we're dealing with this kind of conflict, if you can't show respect and love for the people you disagree with, good luck imitating Christ when there's someone actually pounding nails into you. A couple of weeks ago, Justin and I were down at Pepperdine, and Richard Mao, not related to the chairman, was also there to talk to us, or talk with the group. And one of the things that he stressed was the idea of convicted civility. That for Christians, civility is not just something where we're giving up our beliefs in order to get along. It's part of our conviction as Christians that we need to be able to show respect to those who disagree with us.
All right, last point. And this is an important one. Remember, I already am gay. The question is now what? Here's what I mean. A lot of times we have these conversations and it's like, homosexuality, pro or con? Which side of this are you on? Well, for Ron and for me, that's not an option. It's not, are we for or against homosexuality as this sort of vague idea. It's not, would we rather be gay or straight, The question is, given where we are, given what we're experiencing, how do we live? And how can the church be there for people like us? Let me give you a fun little illustration. Imagine that God calls you on the phone. Like for real, God calls you, this is the call. God's calling you on the phone, and you miss the call. And your friend answers your phone and takes a message. And so your friend gets off the phone and he's like, hey, that was God. And you're like, what? And he's like, yeah, he had a message for you. I'm like, okay, what did God say? Your friend's like, God said, you are going to fall in love one day and get married. Married people in the audience, imagine this has not happened for you yet. You're going to fall in love one day and get married, but you can never have sex. Now, as you let that sink in, you're reeling a little bit from this. What's this going to look like in your life? Your friend goes, oh, wait, maybe that's wrong. Maybe he said, no, he said, you can never fall in love or get married or have sex. That's what it was. Or maybe it was, you can fall in love, but you can't have sex until you get married. Anyway, it was something like that. Basically, it was negative. It was about you. It was about sex. Basically, you, sex, no. How many of you would be content to just leave it at that? Oh, okay. Those are 3 very different messages. I imagine some of you would be tempted to strangle your friend at this point. I don't know many straight... What's that? Love your enemies. Yeah, well, I said tempted. Tempted. I don't know very many straight Christians who would put up with that as the final word on the matter. And yet often gay Christians are asked to basically take that as the church's message. It's sort of like homosexuality as this vague concept is sinful. And it's like, well, okay, wait, so what does that mean? Does that mean I can't have sex? Or I can't, can I be in a relationship? Could I have a romantic relationship even? Could we live together? Could we hold hands? Could we kiss if we don't have sex? Or, I mean, what's that? And a lot of times when we ask these questions, a lot of Christians say, look, you're just trying to split hairs. I mean, it's clear, homosexuality is a sin. Don't try to get as far, as close to the line as you can without stepping over. It's like, no, I'm not trying to split hairs. I'm trying to follow God. I'm trying to figure out what the message is. And a lot of Christians have spent a lot of time thinking about, are they for or against homosexuality as a concept? But they haven't really thought about, how am I going to live my life? Am I allowed to fall in love? If I keep it non-sexual, can I fall in love? Or is that wrong? And how do we know? And what does the Bible say? And if you think that it's wrong for me to fall in love or ever be in a relationship, will your church support me in lifelong celibacy? What if I get old? What if I get sick? My mom died in August of a terrible brain disease. She was sick for 8 years, and the only reason she lived that long was because my dad was there to take care of her. This is a potentially genetic disease, so what happens to me? Who takes care of me if I'm alone? Is the church going to do that? We haven't asked these questions, right? We haven't asked these questions. And a lot of single people are like, hey, we haven't asked these questions for any of us, gay or straight. But the church needs to ask them. And if the church says, no, we think you can fall in love, will the church be there to help us figure out the sexual ethics of the situation? The question isn't homosexuality pro or con. The question is, okay, there are gay people. There are gay people on this campus. There are gay people in your congregation. For them and for the church, now what?
So now we're going to address the question, now what? And Justin and I, now having talked a bit about how to build bridges, are going to talk about how to break them down again. This is where all the Washingtonians in the audience get interested. No, I think although now we're going to talk about more of how we disagree, I think it's important to say that Justin and I have actually learned an amazing amount about our faith from this disagreement. That because this has gone much deeper than just the sort of soundbite kinds of arguments that you hear out in the culture, that this is something that we've been engaged with fairly deeply for a long time, I'm pretty deeply challenged by some of the arguments that Justin makes to think a lot more deeply. Instead of just saying, well, there's this Bible verse that says, I have to think about how to interpret those Bible verses in context. Justin will do a lot to try to suggest alternate contexts in a few minutes. But I want to stress, I think it's really important to see that this sort of challenge isn't just something that undermines faith. It's something that challenges us to think more deeply about our faith, to think about it in the context of the overall message of the gospel, and to really be serious about what it means to follow Christ.
Okay, this is where I start talking fast. So as I was looking at this, the question for me was the now what? What's the rest of my life look like? And I assumed I would find the answer in the Bible, but to be honest, a lot of the scriptures were not particularly helpful. The Bible actually doesn't talk about homosexuality a whole lot. I mean, we've got the Sodom story where men threaten to gang rape angels. That doesn't really sound like my life. We've got the Gibeah story, which a lot of people forget about, where men threaten to gang rape a visitor just like in the Sodom story, but then they rape and murder his concubine instead, which suggests to me that there's a lot about the cultural context of some of these passages that maybe we don't quite get when we read them initially. Leviticus does give us a general prohibition, don't lie with a man as with a woman, But the same section of Scripture also condemns having a tattoo, shaving, wearing mixed fabrics, or a married couple having sex during the woman's period. I have never heard a sermon on that. But for me, the real question was, what does the New Testament say? And the New Testament doesn't say a whole lot, but we do get in Romans 1, Paul describing people who turned from God to worship idols, and as a result, God gave them over to lusts out of control, so that they would receive in themselves, through their own shameful behavior, including same-sex sex, the penalty for turning from God. Now that didn't sound like me either. I hadn't turned from God. I mean, even if you take worshiping idols sort of metaphorically, I hadn't done that either, at least I didn't think so. This is also a weird passage because, and we don't really have time to get into this. Well, maybe Ron does. I don't have time to get into this. But Romans 1 is actually a rhetorical device where Paul is setting up his audience by pointing the finger at someone else and saying, hey, see how bad those sinners are over there? And he's not challenging them in Romans 1. He's saying, hey, you know those sinners, those folks over there. Some scholars think that he was referring to the Roman fertility cults where people did worship idols and have these kinds of orgies. But whoever they were, look at those people over there. Aren't they sinful? Aren't they sinful? And as his audience says, yeah, they absolutely are. Then in Romans 2, he goes, guess what? At whatever point you're condemning them, you're condemning yourself because you're just as sinful, and this is why we all need Christ. This is his point in Romans. But that doesn't really answer the question, right? What exactly is he talking about, and what is he condemning, and how come it didn't really look a whole lot like my life? The only other place in the New Testament that homosexuality is mentioned is a single word, and the word is arsenokoitai. It shows up in two of Paul's vice lists, where he's listing groups of sinners, without any context. And most scholars have debated about what this word means, but most scholars translate it as something to do with men having sex with men. The NIV used to translate it as homosexual offenders, leading one of my friends to say, the Bible condemns homosexual offenders, so stop offending the homosexuals. But in all seriousness, this word, as I studied it, really meant a lot to me. Like, what does it mean? And I read arguments that, oh, well, maybe it's referring to the kind of behavior talked about in Romans, that sort of idol worship, fertility cult stuff. Maybe it's talking about the most common form of male-male sex in Greco-Roman culture at the time, which was married men having sex with boys, which, we would all condemn today. Or maybe it's referring to something that includes modern committed monogamous relationships. And scholars didn't agree, and it's kind of important. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that none of these passages addresses romance at all. Like, none of them addresses the question of whether it's okay for me to be holding hands in church with a guy that I like, and yet I can pretty much guarantee that in a lot of churches across America, if I did that, I'd get a lot of evil looks, and some people would ask me to leave. So what does this mean? Can I have someone to take care of me? Is it wrong for me to want to kiss somebody? Is that a violation of God's created order? I mean, if you say no, I don't know where the scriptural support is for that. But if you say yes, that it's okay, then, well, what about marriage? I mean, is that too far because of arsenokoitai, because of Romans 1? And then there's this question of, Paul telling married couples, don't deprive each other of sex for too long because you want to fall into temptation. Sex is not really the driving thing for me in this, but it is an important part of marriage. Is it better to be in a committed relationship and avoid that temptation? Like, these are important questions, right? One of the things I find is that people who have not met any gay couples that are showing good fruit in their lives, people whose only experiences with gay people have been people living, unhealthy, promiscuous, drug-addicted, sex-obsessed lives, have no problem saying, well, it's all condemned across the board because, well, what they see looks sinful, and so it is sinful, and the plain sense of Scripture says it's sinful, and there you go. But those of us who have met gay couples who have been together for many years and who show just all this good fruit in their relationship, in a Christ-centered relationship, it's harder to just stop at the plain sense of Scripture because we go, oh, something about this doesn't look like sin. I kind of know what sin looks like, and this doesn't quite look like sin, and yet, does the Bible say that it's sin? And so people feel torn. It's this heart versus head thing. Anyway, heart versus head thing, there you go. One of the things that I find interesting is that throughout history, the church has wrestled with many such issues. For instance, during the Civil War, I was just reading a book on this that was written by a well-respected church historian named Mark Knoll called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. And it turns out that during the Civil War, many Christians were similarly torn over the question of slavery. Because you see, the Bible is clear. Teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything. Or here in 1 Timothy, let all under this yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful to them. Rather, they must serve them all the more. So clearly, and these are just a couple of examples, over and over, we see the Bible condoning slavery and saying that Christians were slaveholders and that slaves should be subservient to their masters. What's interesting is that during the Civil War, many abolitionists got to the point of being abolitionists by throwing out the Bible. And this caused many Christians to fight in support of slavery because slavery had become the litmus test for whether you really believed in the Bible. Mark Knoll puts it this way: by defining slaveholding as a basic evil, whatever the Bible might say about it, radical abolitionists frightened away from anti-slavery many moderates who had also grown troubled, but who were not willing to give up loyalty to Scripture. He also says this: the stronger their arguments, the abolitionists' arguments, based on general humanitarian principles became, that social justice, it's the right thing to do, the weaker the Bible looked in any traditional sense. By contrast, rebuttal of such arguments from biblical principle increasingly came to look like a defense of Scripture itself. For those who didn't like what they saw in the slave system, it was that same heart versus head thing. I see abuses happening, but the Bible, did they do what felt right, or did they support the Bible? Some tried to argue you could do both, but those arguments were widely viewed as incredibly weak by many, many Christian theologians, saying things like this one in 1846, the evidence that there were both slaves and masters of slaves in the churches founded and directed by the apostles cannot be got rid of without resorting to methods of interpretation which will get rid of everything. I've heard similar arguments about homosexuality. Moses Stewart, who Knoll says was widely recognized as the nation's most learned biblical scholar in 1850, wrote that abolitionists must either give up the New Testament authority or abandon the fiery course which they are pursuing. In other words, they need to either just admit that they don't believe in the Bible, or else they need to stop being abolitionists. J.W. Tucker, a Southern Methodist minister, said to a Confederate, that is pro-slavery, of course, audience, "Your cause is the cause of God, the cause of Christ, of humanity, is a conflict of truth with error, of Bible with northern infidelity, of pure Christianity with northern fanaticism." The Southern Baptist Church, which both Ron and I grew up in, was founded on this principle. The Southern Baptist Church was the nation's largest Protestant denomination today, was founded on support of slavery. Now, no Southern Baptist would support slavery today, but it's important for us to have a sense of our own history. There were Christians who tried to argue against slavery from the Bible, but the problem was it was a difficult argument to make because they had to argue against the plain sense of Scripture. They had to use general principles and lots of cultural context. And so Mark Knoll says this: nuanced biblical attacks on American slavery faced rough going precisely because they were nuanced. This position could not simply be read out of any one biblical text. It could not be lifted directly from the page. Rather, it needed patient reflection on the entirety of the Scriptures. It required expert knowledge of the historical circumstances of ancient Near Eastern and Roman slave systems. And it demanded that sophisticated interpretive practice replace a commonsensical, literal approach to the sacred text. Now, I'm not saying that, if you come to a particular conclusion on slavery, you need to come to a particular conclusion on marriage or gay relationships. But it's important for us to have this historical context, and it's not just slavery. There are many issues in Scripture that require us to wrestle with cultural context. For instance, Paul says, "I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She's to keep silent." Or in 1 Corinthians, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. Or here's another one about women. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut or shaved off, she should cover her head. Now, most Christians I know would say that these are cultural mores, that these are about what was going on in Paul's day, that the women were doing something in the church and it was causing a disruption. I'm sure you've heard many of these arguments. But are we sure? How do we know? And is that any different from saying, well, in Paul's day, the homosexual behavior that was going on was very different from today? Or what about divorce? Jesus says that whoever divorces and marries someone else commits adultery. The late Lewis Smedes, a professor of theology and ethics at Fuller Seminary, used to tell the story of how his church used to understand this passage as saying that, well, if you're committing adultery, that means that the second marriage is not valid. The first marriage is still valid. Even if you've been with the current spouse for 10 years, it's an invalid marriage. You're still living in sin. And so if you want to become a member of the church, you have to leave your current spouse you've been with for 10 years and go back and reunite with the former spouse. Now, I don't know many Christians who would say that today. And his congregation eventually shifted. And the reason they shifted was because they began to know a lot of divorced people as the culture changed. Their children were getting divorced. And what they ultimately came to was the conclusion that, hey, divorce is not a good thing. God's desire is for marriage to last. But that was the point Jesus was making. He was addressing a situation that was going on then. And we can say what happened in the past is wrong, but the current relationship and that commitment that exists is a good thing, even if you didn't get there in a good way. As Christians, we have a history of reevaluating our interpretations when we recognize that we're putting undue burdens on people, that our old interpretation is lacking in grace. And I think that's the right thing to do. It's how Jesus responded to the Pharisees when they were angry that he healed a man's hand on the Sabbath. He says, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? What's a false dichotomy, right? Nobody was asking him to kill the guy. But the point is, I think, that it's not about the letter of the law, not just about the letter of the law. The human impact of your actions matters. And he gives them examples. In several places in Scripture, he says, haven't you read about David? When he and his companions were hungry, they had no food, and they ate the bread of the presence. Only priests were allowed to eat the bread of the presence. They clearly violated God's law, but it was the only food they had. Wasn't that the right thing to do? What if one of you has a son or ox who falls into a well on the Sabbath? Won't you pull him out, even though you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath? It's clearly work. But isn't it the right thing to do, not to leave your son in the well overnight? Because the Sabbath, he says, was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The law was put in charge to lead us to Christ. Christ didn't come to lead us to the law. I think this is why, Paul says if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under law. I don't think he's saying we're free to indulge our selfish, sinful desires. Shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? By no means. But rather, we're freed from the law when it becomes a burden and a barrier to showing one another grace and love. You were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Circumcision was one of those barriers, and Paul didn't just say you don't have to be circumcised. He actually said, if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all, because you're putting yourselves back under the law. He's basically saying, look, this is a burden. It's not helping you live out the agape love that God has called you to live out, and it is keeping people from Christ, requiring them to submit to this. By contrast, the Pharisees, according to Jesus in Matthew 23, tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them, which to me looks a lot like the church's current approach to gay people. So this is really what the abolitionists argued, that emphasizing the letter of the law over grace toward real people was doing an injustice. And that makes sense to us now, but back then we got it wrong. As Mark Knoll points out, such use of the Bible doubtless carries more weight today than it did in 1860, when the way that Christian abolitionists reasoned disturbed broad reaches of American religious opinion. At the time, the conviction that they could easily separate the Bible's anti-slavery spirit from its pro-slavery letter was not only a minority position, it was also widely perceived as a theologically dangerous position. So whether we're talking about slavery, women, or gays, these are difficult questions. But the Scriptures repeatedly call us to interpret everything through a lens of God's agape love. And so Paul says, Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for those who love others have fulfilled the law. All the commandments, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet, whatever commandment there may be are summed up in this rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. I quote this passage a lot, and people have accused me of saying, well, if you take something sinful and add love to it, then that means it's okay, which is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is I believe God's agape love leads us to do the right thing, to be faithful to our spouse, regardless of whether there's a rule that says don't commit adultery. It leads us to pull the child out of the well, even when that's contradicting the rule on the Sabbath. It leads us to free the slaves, to allow our sisters to teach and speak in church, to celebrate the goodness and faithfulness in a second marriage, even if the divorce that came before it was wrong. And I believe it will also lead us to celebrate the good fruit that is in a loving, committed, Christ-centered gay relationship, rejecting a past where we've put such heavy burdens on people that we break those people and haven't lifted a finger to help them. Because ultimately, God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
So first of all, I was paying attention to the clock, and when we went into our time, I had 3 minutes more for explaining my position. So that's a major win here. First of all, I want to respond briefly before I go into my discussion. I want to say something about the slavery analogy. And I think Mark Knoll, as a matter of fact, I read the book first and recommended it to Justin. But one of the things, I think Mark Knoll is right, that American Christianity tends to like soundbite kind of thing. I mean, this is not just American Christianity, this is American culture. We have a phrase like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, written by a slave owner. And so you could have the founding fathers with this very soaring rhetoric of freedom, but many of them were not willing to apply those claims of equality to their own slaves, who they negotiated to count as 3/5 of a person in the Constitution. So I think one of the things that's distressing about American culture is the way that we like to yell at each other in sound bites, and that we don't want to get into the nuance of really trying to understand and grapple with the difficult questions. Instead, we want to have a sound bite and then claim our side and yell at the people who disagree with us. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the conversations that Justin and I have is that we are able to get into really deep, thoughtful discussions rather than I'm the bigot and he's the libertine. But I think when we get into the nuances, one of the things that was lost in the slavery discussion was, for example, the Bible has some pretty clear teachings on marriage. But if you were a slave owner and you had 2 married slaves, you could sell one of them. And it didn't matter that you were breaking up a marriage. You could force your slaves to breed like animals. And it didn't matter that you were forcing them to fornicate or commit adultery. You could take children from their parents, despite all of the teachings in the Bible about the relationship between parents and children, and the way that that relationship is the image of God's relationship with his people. What did we do to the understanding of God's fatherhood when we rip children from their fathers for profit? And I think if Southern slave owners had been willing to go beyond a couple of verses that authorized some form of slavery in the ancient world and had grappled with what they were doing and how many key core Christian teachings they were trampling on. I mean, not only that, for slave owners, if they forced their slaves to have sex with them, there was no legal penalty for that. We created a system where a big chunk of the population was free to be raped. Justify that in light of the New Testament or the Old Testament. So I think it's really important to stress that what happened was not just that the slave owners had the Bible on their side and that the abolitionists did not. You had to dig a little bit deeper than just looking at the passages that approved of slavery. But if there had been a serious and thoughtful examination of what was being done to slaves on plantations in the South in light of the Christian teaching on how we are to treat each other, we would swiftly have found that there were grievous abuses that no Christian could approve. All right, so first of all, I want to give a very brief overview. So as it turns out, as Justin said, there's not a lot that we have direct biblical stuff about homosexuality, but I'll give a brief discussion of that. I'll then try to place that teaching in context, give us a little bit broader perspective. A big part of that context will be looking at the role of creation in Christian sexual ethics. And then finally, I'll talk about friendship and Christian community and how that should apply to our approach here. All right, so let's first of all look at Paul's teaching on homosexuality. So we have two verses have this word arsenokoitai that Justin mentioned. This is a tough word to understand. I think the best place to get context for this is in Leviticus, the Septuagint translation of Leviticus. This is Greek. Obviously, it's only partially Greek up there because I wanted to make it easier for you to understand. But Leviticus 18:22, the Septuagint reads, "You shall not koiten, lie with, a arson, man, as with a woman." And so I think when we're looking at arsenokoitai, it is the first time that that word is used in written Greek, at least of the written Greek that we have access to. However, the most likely context is that here Paul is making a reference back to the Old Testament. And a good reason for that is that in 1 Timothy, this is actually a discussion of the law was given to these various kinds of lawbreakers. And then there's a list of various kinds of lawbreakers. And if arsenokoitai refers to those who break the law against men having sex with men, it would make sense for that to be on the list. If it was something else, it's hard to know what it would refer to in the law. So that's a good reason for interpreting it that way. So then we have Romans 1:26-27, where we talk about that men having sex with men or women having sex with women is contrary to nature. Well, what do you do to be contrary to nature? Nature is one of those tricky words. C.S. Lewis has a book called Studies in Words. He spends 50 pages wandering around the different meanings of nature. So a few things that this might mean. You might think of nature as everything that exists. We're the whole realm of nature mind. But then, of course, it's hard for anything to be contrary to nature in that sense. Maybe a black hole that swallows things up. But in that sense of nature, homosexuality is part of it, just as Nazis and various other things are part of nature, along with beautiful sunsets. You might think of nature as what animals do, but how should I say this? If you have much experience with animals, you will probably have deduced that it is not a good idea to base a Christian sexual ethic on what animals do. At least the postman hopes not. I'll let you finish laughing. All right. But then I think the most plausible meaning for nature here is human nature. That this is contrary to human nature, created in God's image and created male and female. At least so I would suggest, although I am exegeting a lot out of a few words here. All right, so let's think a little bit about placing Paul's teaching in context. And to do that, the first thing that I want to do is compare what he says about homosexuality and circumcision. So homosexuality, we have just a few verses, and it seems like Paul assumes that his audience agrees with him. He doesn't explain it, he just throws out gay sex is a sin and seems to assume that that's going to be accepted by the audience. Then there's circumcision, which was the issue that people debated angrily about at the time that Paul was writing. If you wanted to know where someone sat on the kind of primary fault lines in the early church, you asked them their opinion on circumcision. If they were for it, they belonged to the party of James, and they thought that everyone had to follow all parts of the Old Testament law. So this, where someone stood on circumcision, told you where they stood on a whole range of theological questions relating to the relationship between the Old and New Testament, the relationship between Jesus and the Old Covenant, and if they said you didn't have to be circumcised, that told you that they belonged to Paul's group, and then it was a whole different understanding of the relationship between the Old and New Testament, between the Old and New Covenant, between the law of Moses and discipleship to Christ. And you'll notice Paul goes on and on and on about the question of circumcision, because this was a question that people actively were arguing about. And he couldn't just say, this is my position, because then a whole bunch of people would say, well, but, God said to Abraham, you have to be circumcised, and this is the mark of the covenant, and if you don't have that mark, then you're not in relationship with God. You have to have that mark in order to be eligible to be part of the community that Christ came to save. So Paul has to address this at great depth, and in a way that explains, there's some extraordinary theology in Paul's explanations of why you don't have to be circumcised. A question that if we had organized a talk on circumcision, yes or no for Christians, my guess is it would not draw quite as large a crowd. I think hardly anyone today thinks this is a question worth arguing about. So another example is Paul's pastoral approach in Athens and Corinth. So when he comes to Mars Hill in Athens, he quotes Greek philosophy, he talks about the temples, he talks about the unknown God, he quotes Greek poetry. When he comes to Corinth, he says, I resolved to know nothing among you but Jesus and him crucified. No Greek poetry, no Greek philosophy. He has negative things to say about Greek wisdom. He focuses on the foolishness of God. So is Paul schizophrenic? Or is he speaking to two very different audiences? That in Athens, he's speaking to people who are coming from one perspective, and he presents the gospel in a way that will speak to them. And in Corinth, speaking to people who are not well-educated, who are not not exactly classics back then, but are not educated in poetry, philosophy, they're poor, they're weak. And he says, you know what? I'm going to talk to you about the God who is not a Greek philosopher, who is not this learned person. He was poor, he was weak, he was crucified, and he's there for you. So Paul adjusts his message, not to contradict the gospel, but the way that he presents it is very different depending on who he's talking to. And so here's my rather controversial statement that if Paul were writing to the church today, he would not give us these brief quotes on homosexuality. We would have incredibly rich theological treatises explaining why he takes the stand that he does. So now I'm going to try and say a little bit about what that might look like. I'm humble, huh? All right. So first, I want to focus particularly on the relationship between creation and sexual ethics. And I think this is a good place to start. In Romans 1, Paul starts with the idea that people had rejected, although God's power was evident in creation, although you could see things about him in creation, humanity had rejected God and suppressed the truths that were available in creation. And this suppression leads, among many other things, homosexuality is just one item on a much broader list, but it's there. So I think I'm not twisting Paul to say that creation is important. So Jesus talks about divorce in Matthew 19, and in Matthew 19 and Mark 10, he appeals back to Genesis 1 and 2. God created human beings, male and female, and the man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So this creation story of male and female is really crucial, and it's not just a fact that happens to be true, but something that can be appealed to with moral force. And the interesting thing about the Southern Baptists that I grew up with, who treated divorce and remarriage as an expression of grace, my friend and colleague here, is that the position that was being advanced as the more gracious position was the position that the Pharisees adopted, that we should have a more tolerant view of divorce and remarriage, and that Christ, full of grace and truth, is the one who's actually advocating a stricter position on divorce and remarriage than the position of the Pharisees. I think that's something we should at least stop and think for a long time, more time than I have to dwell on tonight. Christ and the church. In Ephesians, Paul quotes a man leaving his father and mother and cleaving to his wife, and then he says, this is a profound mystery, but it refers to Christ and the church. God created marriage, and created it not just to be something for us in this life, but to be a pointer toward our ultimate union with Christ. And so if we get marriage wrong, then it's not pointing to what God intended it to point to. And then finally, again, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul points back to becoming one flesh in the context of talking about sex with a prostitute, that even when someone has sex with a prostitute, they are becoming one flesh with them. And one of the things, he says, therefore, you are not your own, you were bought with a price. So glorify God with your body. Now, once upon a time when I worked at Microsoft and had money, I owned a house. Very nice house here in Seattle, and therefore very expensive. But when I owned that house, at a certain point there were some problems that I found in it that I needed to do work on it. And so I could just recognize that needs to be done. It was a wiring problem, so it was probably needed to be done quickly, and start tearing walls down so that I could fix it right away. On the other hand, as a poor grad student who rents, at one point I had a rental contract where I had to have written permission from the landlord to put a nail in the wall to hang a picture. And I think it's important to see, our culture talks about own it, this is my body, I own it, I can do what I want with it. The sexual ethic of our culture is the sexual ethic of people who think they own their bodies. The Christian sexual ethic is a sexual ethic of people who believe that our bodies are owned by God and entrusted to us, and that we have to hold them in trust, not simply do with them whatever we want. Now, if you're interested in learning more, this book, Creation and Covenant by Christopher Roberts is a very in-depth examination of the way that this idea of sexual difference has played out in the Christian tradition. Now I want to talk about, very briefly at the end, the notion of spiritual friendship. And this I drew from a book called Elred of Rievaulx's Spiritual Friendship. Elred of Rievaulx was a medieval monk. And what was particularly meaningful to me was the notion that he talked about three kinds of friendship. And these three kinds of friendship were rooted in three different ways of seeing what is my ultimate purpose in life. So suppose that my ultimate purpose in life is pleasure. What I'm looking for is a good time. And so I find friends who are looking for a good time. And our friendship is based on looking for a good time together. And this is a common kind of friendship in our culture. But it's based on, that if that's what you're looking for, then that's probably what you're going to get. But a good time is fleeting. And the kind of friendship that's based around looking for a good time together tends to be fleeting as well, and people tend to move on. And then there's worldly friendship. A little while ago I spoke in DC, and it was really easy to talk about worldly friendship there. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours is a language that they know pretty well in DC. But this is, if your ultimate goal is to get ahead in life, then you find other people whose ultimate goal is to get ahead in life, and your friendship is based on you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But then spiritual friendship. What happens when our life is focused on discipleship in Christ, honoring our bodies, honoring each other's bodies, growing together in Christ, understanding what ultimate union with Christ is, encouraging each other in that? That is spiritual friendship. And that, I think, is the ultimate goal that we should be pursuing. Now, obviously, I would interpret that in one way. I think Justin and I, although we disagree, we're both very focused on trying to understand God's will and in learning from each other in that. And so spiritual friendship need not mean complete agreement, but it does need to mean focus on honoring God above all. And then just to close, I'll mention this Wesley Hill's Washed and Waiting. Unlike Justin, I don't have a book, so I have to steal books from other people. But I would recommend, if you're interested in hearing more in-depth perspective of someone who's chosen celibacy, Wesley Hill's Washed and Waiting is a good book. And then finally, if what we've said has whetted your appetite a little bit, both Justin and I are on the internet, and you can find us in various places. As you can see, Justin spends more time than I do. I have papers to grade. But if you want to find more about us, just go ahead there. Thanks.
So here's what we're going to do. We're not done yet. We're going to take about a 3-minute break so you can stretch your legs. And as you do that, you're going to see a text number go up on the screen. And we're going to do question and answer via text. They're anonymous texts. You can say anything you want, but I'm going to decide what I read. So be wise and take a 3-minute break. Run.
All right.
Can you define what you mean by celibacy?
Not having sex. You probably want more than that. In some ways, it's what? How do I define celibacy? And the answer was not having sex. I mean, it's actually, I think, a little bit challenging to say what exactly that means beyond not having sex. So in the Catholic Church, if you were to become a member of a particular religious order, then there are specific rules that explain, for people in that way of life, what does celibacy mean. But it's actually different depending on where you're at, what sort of restrictions. There are some religious orders where people cannot have interaction with people of the opposite sex. And then there are other religious orders where that's completely allowed. I think if you're single, obviously you don't have the religious community. And so then the question is, what sort of relationships can you form? And again, I think that, obviously don't have sex is an important part of celibacy, but what sort of relational structure you build, whether that's a large network of other Christian friends or whether that's living with one or two other people who are celibate, it seems to me that that's something that there's a lot of room for different approaches to.
There's a follow-up question to that. How is your idea of spiritual friendship related to the idea of a covenant relationship? Are those similar? How are they different?
Okay, the question was, how is spiritual friendship related to the idea of a covenant relationship? I would say that a covenant relationship would be one possible form of a spiritual friendship. I haven't really tried to flesh out, there's a lot of debates about that, but I wouldn't want to come down really hard and say that a covenant relationship is a really good idea, because there's possible ways that can be a source of temptation. But I also wouldn't want to say it's a really bad idea. Obviously, in some sense, you don't want to say that healthy spiritual friendship should not last more than 3 years, and then you should move on to someone else. That would be a really, really dumb way of approaching it. I think you want to be careful about sort of unhealthy latching on to one person, but I think that's true of marriage. That if you think of marriage as all of your relational needs are going to be met in this one person, after a little while, you're probably going to be very disappointed or living alone.
On that note, I think this is a question for Justin now.
About time.
Just make sure we get this through. So when it comes to romantic relationships, do you think that a same-gender relationship may display a different set of God's characteristics than an opposite-gender relationship? And so do you think of anything about these both reflecting different aspects of God?
Okay, do I think that a same-gender romantic relationship reflects different characteristics of God? Then I cannot talk today. I don't know what it is. Than opposite gender. To me, I'm always nervous about trying to put things in boxes and generalize too much. Because I think this is one of the things that's a challenge in these kinds of conversations. We can say, for instance, in general, men and women are different in ways aside from biology. And this is true. We can say that men tend to be better at certain things and women tend to be better at certain things. And this is something that's been tested, for instance, with which gender tends to do better on tests of spatial skills and which tends to do better on tests of verbal skills and all those kinds of things. But that does not mean that every man is better than every woman at certain things and every woman is better than every man at certain things. The reality is we're diverse people. And I think it is good to recognize the average differences that exist, but it is a little dangerous if we then extrapolate from that to say then all men are this way and all women are this way. And then we start getting into this complementarity stuff where we say that this is how it looks when a man and a woman are in a relationship together. Because the reality is when we create these boxes, we find that there are many, just talking about heterosexual relationships, many couples who don't display those particular dynamics. And I think the same thing is true of same-sex couples. And so I would say that I think in general, we all tend to be attracted to people who have some things in common with us and also have some things that complement who we are. And that can be true regardless of gender, and it can be true regardless of who we are. But I think all of us, as individuals and as couples, reflect God's character in a lot of different ways. So that's sort of my long, rambling, complicated, nuanced answer. But yeah.
We like that. We're a university. So I can tell from the questions, as expected, there are a variety of viewpoints represented in this room, and we also like that because we're a university. But there's a common question, whether you're on the left or the right, what do you think the church can be doing better to support the LGBT community as humans?
Well, since I'm on the left, so I think that the first and most important thing is that it needs to be a conversation with LGBT people rather than a conversation about LGBT people. That it's really critical that the church make an effort to listen, make an effort to be a safe place for... There are many conservative churches that have people that they could be listening to, but they've created an environment in which it would be dangerous for those people to speak up. They would be shunned by some of their fellow Christians if they did. And so those congregations are missing out on the voices of people who could do more than anyone else to help them understand an issue on which they are unfortunately alienating the surrounding culture. And so I think it's really important to create an environment in which it is possible for people to talk with those that they disagree with. And I think this is also true. The secular culture is not doing a good job of having conversations with Christians on the issue. If you read, say, for example, Slate magazine, you would not get a lot of conversation with Christians. You would get a lot of conversation about Christians. Okay, right man, go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, I agree with everything you just said, which happens sometimes, but not always. I think on top of that, I'll echo what I said earlier, that it is always about the now what. It's always about, I don't need someone to tell me all the things I shouldn't do, because the question for me is what should I do, and how will I live, and what does the rest of my life look like? And also, even if we disagree, can I be a person to you and not an issue? When I was, I tell this story in my book, but when I was a college student, I was still wrestling with all these questions. I hadn't figured out what the rest of my life was going to look like yet, but I had figured out that I was gay. I didn't know what that meant. But I was part of the Christian fellowship on campus. I went to a secular school. And I didn't tell a lot of people that I was gay, but word tends to get around. Christians are really good at gossiping. We just call it like prayer circles or something like that. You know who really needs prayer? And so one of the leaders of this group invited me to lunch one day. We went to lunch. And I was thinking, wow, this is really cool. Like, one of the leaders of the group is taking an interest in me as a person. And it was a big group of people. And we get there, and he starts off with small talk, how's life, how are your classes, how's everything going? And I'm like, oh, yeah, it's fine. And, things are going fine. And then he pulls out this big Bible, and he's like, all right, Justin, I would like to share some passages with you and hear your response to them. And I was like, what's going on? And he starts going through these passages and saying, well, you know, Leviticus says such and such, and you know, what do you say to that? And I would say, okay, well, it says don't lie with a man as with a woman. I mean, I'm not lying with anybody. I mean, maybe my stuffed animals or something, but I actually have stuffed animals in my bed. Usually. But he's like, you know, and I'm like, you know, kind of caught me off guard. And as I start to respond, trying to answer the question, I don't even get a sentence in before he's already turning to the next verse. And with every verse, he got louder and louder and louder. And I finally realized, although he said he wanted to hear my response, he didn't really want to hear my response. What he really wanted was to tell me what he believed and why I was wrong. But he didn't know the first thing about me. He'd heard that I was gay, but he didn't know anything else about me. He didn't know whether I was having sex or whether I ever planned to or whether I was in a relationship or what I had been through or any of the struggles that he had no idea. And I went home and I just cried. And the next time that a Christian leader invited me to lunch, I didn't want to go. And I contrast that with the time I met Tony Campolo. Really amazing Baptist minister, author. Tony and his wife disagree on this issue. Tony is on Ron's side and his wife Peggy is on my side. And they do presentations on how they disagree and how they can love each other as husband and wife and still respect each other's faith even though they disagree. And so Tony was there to speak to this same Christian fellowship. And he was just hanging out. There was this big group of people, you know, all milling about, and he was just hanging out. And I got up the guts to go up to him and introduce myself. And I planned to introduce myself to him as both a member of the executive board of the gay student group on campus and part of the Christian fellowship. But all that I got out was, my name is Justin Lee, and I'm part of the gay student group on campus. And before I even got to the Christian part, he just says, well, I'm so glad you're here, and gave me the big hug. And it was the first time since I had come out as gay that a heterosexual man not related to me had given me a hug. And I was just floored. And I said, well, I mean, I'm also a Christian, and I've heard about the stuff that you and your wife do. And he's like, well, come here, tell me all about your story. And he brought me over to the corner of the room and sat me down and spent 5 minutes, as he's getting ready to get up and give a presentation. He spent like 5 minutes just listening to my story. He didn't ask, well, what do you think about these passages? Or, you know, are you involved in a sexual relationship? Or do you plan to be in a sexual relationship? He didn't ask me any of that. He just showed me love and made me feel heard and cared about. And I can tell you, if every Christian treated the people who disagreed with them, whatever side you're on this issue, the way that Tony Campolo treated me that night, we would not be having to have this conversation because we would be dealing with it as Christians with grace.
And I'll just... I was just going to mention that the first really positive conversation I had with a Christian leader was also with Tony Campolo, which, you know, if in North Carolina and Washington, you know, Tony Campolo is the first person that you meet. It
does not reflect well on the church.
No. I think it's better now.
Hope so.
A little.
So, we've talked about stories as a good way of learning and listening and understanding people on the other side of the aisle. Do you have specific stories in film or documentaries or books that have really been moving to you in this conversation in any way?
You go first.
Do we have stories in film or documentary books that have been really moving to us? Well, the tough thing for me is, like, I want to right away mention stuff that I've been involved in, right? I don't think I've mentioned this yet tonight. So I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization called the Gay Christian Network, which is not actually just an organization of gay Christians, although it started that way. It's an organization of Christians on both sides of this question who care about LGBT issues. And several years ago, we made a documentary called Through My Eyes. And it's a 45-minute documentary that is basically a collection of stories of young Christians in their teens and 20s wrestling with their sexuality and talking about the things that they experienced with the church and the difficult things. And some of them came to one conclusion and some came to another, but But I conducted the interviews and helped to make the film, and I still find it moving every single time that I watch it because some of the stories are really powerful. And that's available on our website. I promise I'm not just trying to hawk stuff. But I think, golly, just individual stories, I think, are the ones that I find most powerful, though, just hearing, Also, there's this amazing book called Torn by a guy named Justin Lee. I don't know. Actually, Wesley Hill's book, which Ron mentioned, I think is really, really good. I really enjoy that. And I guess I feel like there's kind of a lack of really great resources that I can think of that focus on story, because so much of the stuff that's been written is all about, arguing the Bible, which is really important, but it's nice to hear more stories.
I think I would echo what Justin just said, but I would also add the book Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. It's, I think, from the 1940s, but it's a novel that has been very high both on Christian book lists and on gay lesbian book lists. It's a really rare example of a story that has appealed. The story of love between two men in the novel has resonated very strongly with the gay lesbian community. It's seen as a classic of gay lesbian literature, but it's also a very powerful Christian story and has been strongly embraced by even very conservative Christians. So I would recommend that as an example of a book that really engages deeply with both same-sex love and what it means to obey Christ.
Cool. We just have a couple more things. Next is, as you may be aware, Seattle Pacific University is located in a city that many consider to be quite liberal. Which has
I had not heard that.
Yeah. And that brings with it also having a very active and visible gay population. What do you think about the Christian community here in that context? And what advice do you have for us? And what does that specific context, what should that mean to us and how we work through this?
Do you have any thoughts?
Sure.
North Carolina God boy?
So what does it mean for you guys being in a pretty liberal area with lots of gay folks? I think it's always an opportunity for us as Christians to reach out to those outside of our folds, to reach out to folks and to find ways to show them love. The trick is to do it in a way that people don't feel that they're being pandered to and that people aren't afraid of you, which is tough. The end of the story that I told about the Christian leader who invited me to lunch and then preached at me the whole time is that the next year he got promoted and a new leader came into his same spot and also invited me to lunch. And this time I packed my Bible in my backpack and I spent time rehearsing in the mirror, short one sentence responses to any Bible passage he could throw at me. And I went and I sat there stiff as a board with all my emotional walls up, all my emotional armor on. And as he tried to start with the same kinds of questions, how's life, how are things going, how's class and all this stuff, I just gave him one-word answers, fine. It's fine. And about halfway through lunch, I finally just interrupted him. And I'm like, dude, what is it that you want to talk about? Why did you invite me to lunch? Let's just get it out in the open. Let's just deal with it because we don't have a whole lot of time yet. We're halfway through lunch. And it took him by surprise. And he just looked at me and he said, I am new to the group and you're active in the group and I wanted to get to know you. And I felt about this big. But I tell that story because people who've been hurt by Christians are sometimes really reluctant to sit down and talk to Christians because the assumption is always that you've got an ulterior motive, even if you do everything right. He did everything right, and I wasn't ready to hear anything that he had to say. And the challenge is, because Christians have such a bad reputation, when you try to do an outreach thing or something and say, let's go to the gay bar, let's go to the pride parade or whatever, there are a lot of people who are going to be upset and angry and not want you there because they already have such a negative image of Christians. But I wrote a blog entry a few weeks back where I talked about, that's been going viral in LGBT circles, where I talked about, there are things that you can do if you want to show that you love gay people, whatever your view is on gay marriage. If you want to show that you love gay people, there are things you can do. There are causes that gay people care about. Fight against bullying in schools. Work to support the rights of gay people to, whatever the case may be in their area, whether it's not getting fired from their job, or whether it's, working to help people with AIDS, or whatever the issues are that the gay people in your area care about. You can get involved with those causes and work to make a difference. And when people see your love, when people see that your love is not just words but actions, it makes a difference, and it changes the image that they have of Christians. But it takes a long time.
Okay, well, I'll say a little bit. A couple of things. First of all, one of the challenges that I think Seattle has is that it's a very, very liberal city, but at least some of the Christians, I'm thinking particularly here of Mark Driscoll or Ken Hutcherson, because of the surrounding liberal environment, react very strongly against that. And so in some ways, the tensions here, I think, are a lot higher. In the Midwest, where I am now, not only do you not have the really liberal city environment that Seattle has, or the really active gay community, you also don't have the really loud conservative Christian voices of the extreme kind that you find with Mark Driscoll or Ken Hutcherson. Or found with Ken Hutcherson, since he passed away in the beginning of the year. So I think one of the tensions with Seattle is that the conflict here is much greater than it is in some other parts of the country. And unfortunately, as Christians, we have to deal with the fallout from some louder voices who have done a lot to polarize the discussion. At the same time, the conversations that I saw in Seattle 15 years ago are the conversations that Christians are now having in other parts of the country. And so I think you guys are getting a preview of what the culture is going to look like in other parts of the country down the road. And there's a real opportunity. Honestly, I think a big part of why I get invited to speak at a lot of different places and am seen as a leader who can give Christians advice on this issue is that I was in Seattle in the 90s. And that a lot of the questions that they could put off 15 years ago in other parts of the country didn't have to face were questions that, as a Christian in Seattle, I couldn't ignore, and questions that you as Christians in Seattle today can't ignore. But because I had to grapple with a culture that is the culture that I was dealing with, say, I worked at Microsoft. It's not the most conservative country company in the United States. We had full domestic partner benefits in 1993. So working with gay coworkers, working with just non-Christian coworkers who thought traditional Christian ethics were crazy, I learned a lot about how to deal respectfully with gay people, with non-Christians, and that has served me very well. And Christian culture as the gay marriage fight is being lost and people are realizing the culture has moved beyond where we were at and we need to now start looking for different answers, I think the fact that I realized that was lost a long time ago, and I was living in the kind of culture that now a lot more people are living in, and have been thinking about how to bear witness to the gospel in that context. Now that's really useful knowledge to a lot of people who 10 years ago thought that all we needed to do was get enough votes to vote down gay marriage and we would win the culture wars, who didn't see where the trends were going. And so, I think a lot of what Justin said, I think also just, the New Testament was not the story of people living in a conservative Christian bubble. It's the story of people in a cosmopolitan, non-Christian, very diverse culture. The Roman Empire was a place for mixing. The only thing that really got you in trouble with the Roman Empire was thinking everybody else was wrong. That was one of the things why Christians got persecuted, was that they were not willing to say, you worship your God, we worship our God, but said there is one God. So I think, look at, it's maybe a little bit scary to look at the New Testament, but look at the willingness to bear witness to faith in a culture where people didn't agree, didn't understand. Look at the way that Paul could go into different places and look for the little seeds of the gospel. Now, as I look at Seattle, I think there's actually a lot here. Seattle is a city that really wants to welcome all people. This is a very diverse city. It's a very international city. And so, that's something where Seattle, there's a certain echo of something that's really important to God's heart in Seattle culture. Look for those echoes and look for the ways that the gospel can come to Seattle culture as something, as Paul brings the gospel to philosophers in Athens as a philosophy, as he brings it to the poor and weak in Corinth as the story of a poor, weak man who was struck down by the ruling powers. Find the ways to bring it to Seattle in the form that Seattle will recognize it. Not just watering the gospel down to be what Seattle wants to hear, but finding the points of the gospel that Seattle is ready to hear. And let those points draw people in to begin to wrestle with the parts of the gospel that they're not as ready to hear.
This gives me hope. Maybe I can still be an evangelical Christian if this is possible, right?
Or Catholic.
Maybe I can be a Catholic. I have to think more about that.
Sorry.
Catholics can be evangelical too.
This is true.
That's the lesson of this night. But would you, I trust that we have all learned something by the witness of this friendship and this example of love in the midst of disagreement. So please join me in thanking our speakers, Justin and Ryan. I also want to thank the student body of SPU, because this was a production of ASSP in large part. Student government funded both Ron and Justin's trip here. So thank you, SPU students, and especially thank you to Sam Ernest, who was kind of your voice and your representative in that. And now, Sam will offer a closing prayer.
Thank you. Let's pray. Almighty and ever-living Father, who wonderfully created each one of us, grant that we, your children in church, being bound together in love and obedience to you, may be united in one body by the Holy Spirit, as we continue to think, pray, discuss, and learn together about the beautifully intricate bodies and souls you have made us to be. Open our ears to hear you and to listen to each other. Open our hearts to love and be loved. Open our mouths to testify to the work you are doing in our lives, and also to speak graciously when we disagree. Thank you for the work of Justin and Ron. Thank you for the work that they are doing to bring grace to a difficult dialogue. Grant them safe travels home. Finally, as this Palm Sunday comes to an end and we look ahead to Holy Week, train our eyes on your Son, Jesus Christ, that we may walk in the way of his suffering and share in his resurrection. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. One peace.